and welcome to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. Today we're going to be talking about US-Taiwan relations. There's a lot here. I'm not sure how much depth we're going to go into it, but the basic message that I want to provide is that the United States is not going to fight for Taiwan. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm not saying that miscalculation or insanity of the type that is certainly been exhibited by Trump, but honestly been exhibited in a stronger way by Biden could, in fact lead us to some kind of horrific conflagration over Taiwan. I'm not saying it's utterly impossible. I am saying the United States couldn't possibly win in a military sense. The Taiwanese certainly couldn't possibly win in a military sense. And if there's any sanity in Washington, D.C., it is something that we simply won't do. And there are a number of things that make it look like it's more and more likely that we're going to be abandoning the idea of defending Taiwan. And I just want to make the case why that's a good thing and delve into the history a bit and why Taiwan is such a thing. Obviously, there's a lot going on in U.S. and international politics at the moment. And honestly, I'm a bit knocked on my ass. I am surprised. Part of me is pleased, but I think it's probably not going to be a good thing on balance. But I am surprised to see that a U.S. president is actually trying to shake something up, shake things up after getting elected. This has been what every U.S. voter has been demanding since at least 2008, and Obama, the first Trump administration, and Biden delivered nothing, really, practically speaking, in terms of real shakeup or changes. I don't think the Trump administration is going to end up delivering much. The new one is going to end up delivering much either, but there is certainly some sense that they're truly changing things, and not universally for the worst. But you know what? It's really too early, which is why with this month's live chat, I wanted to dive into Taiwan. In the Q&A, perhaps we'll get into a little bit more what's happening with Trump, with Ukraine, with the USAID, with the U.S. federal government more broadly, Elon Musk, Doge, all that. But that will be for the Q&A. For those of you who are new here, for the public live chats, I tend to do a bit of a presentation, maybe a half hour, maybe 45 minutes, maybe longer. During that presentation, I don't have the mental bandwidth to engage with the comment stream, which you can see probably to the right of your screen. It is... you are invited in our comment stream to say as much as, well, YouTube will allow you to. YouTube's sort of AI has much more stronger censorship principles than we do. You're allowed to say anything you want about me, how stupid I look, my ideas. You're also allowed to, I think we have a broader scope of ideas about foreign policy that are acceptable here. What is not acceptable is attacking other people in the chat or being disruptive to the chat, just sort of cutting and pasted the same stuff over and over again, singling out somebody because of their name, and trying to make fun of them or mock them or say more offensive things. We also are generally against any kind of genocidal language here, against any side. So yeah, don't do that. We have a moderator, Logo Cool Extreme. He is in charge of enforcing this policy. If you violate that policy, he will inform you. And if you don't change your behavior, he will ban you from the comment section of this channel for all time. There is no appeal from the court of Loga. So if he tells you you're acting up, listen to Loga. With that, I guess we will get into it. If someone could just let me know that we're coming through okay. On the last Patrons newscast. We do Patrons newscast. Patrons only newscast, by the way. You might want to consider signing up on Patreon. And the last one we had some real difficulty, so I am now sitting basically on top of my internet, what do you call, router, modem, what have you. So hopefully we'll be without issues. Logan tells me we are good, and that is great to hear. Let's talk about the United States and Taiwan. I wanted to get into this because I have been spending a lot of time diving in on early Chinese-U.S. relations. And U.S.-Chinese relations are more important, I think, to the United States than are typically acknowledged. The first wealthy classes of the United States, mercantile, had a lot to do with Chinese, yes, opium trading or what have you, but just more broad trade with China. The wealthy people of Boston, New York, Philadelphia, specifically, I believe I've read this a couple times recently that the wealth of the very upper crust patrician U.S. president FDR through the Delanos, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was apparently China trade. So there have been deep commercial connections between the United States and China for as long as there's been a United States, more or less. What's really interesting, and I think gets to the sense of betrayal that made the United States so devoted to Taiwan, is the fact that the United States broadly, of course, there's exceptions to this, but by the standards of European or more broadly white countries in the 19th and early 20th century, the United States was had pretty good relations with China. This is in comparison to the British and the French, who rampaged through China in two opium wars, worked very hard to put China in a sort of subaltern or subsidiary position, enforced all kinds of racist legislation on Chinese territory. The biggest stumbling block between U.S. and Chinese relations in the late 19th and early 20th century was U.S. racism within the United States. The beginning of immigration restriction in the United States, I think specifically in California, but also nationally, was racist U.S. legislation against Chinese folks. And the Chinese obviously really didn't like that, but that U.S. policy of racism was balanced with being more willing to treat China as an equal on the international stage than any other great power, certainly in Europe, certainly in Japan. So the United States, the way that the United States saw itself and its relationship with China was that we were helping them against other imperial powers. And now, obviously, this can be caveated in a million ways. This is not, we were not doing it out of the goodness of our hearts. I mean, sometimes we were. I mean, there was a lot of perhaps delusional, but like very meaningful Christian influence in our interactions with China, and missionaries that were sent over that legitimately wanted to, of course, impose our religion, but also educate the Chinese, help the Chinese government, rise up. And one of the really stunning things is the extent to which the nationalist government of China, this is the first set of people that, throughout the empire, throughout the old Chinese imperial family, and had to deal with the imperial ambitions of Japan and did a lot of that fighting, were really suffused with Christian missionary influence from the United States. And the United States was we had ambivalent periods. There's certainly figures like General Stilwell, who really hated Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists, arguably for some legitimate reasons. But more broadly, the United States supported the nationalist government of China that lost the civil war to the communists and that became the government of Taiwan for decades. It's truly, I think I'm currently writing a book called American Empire, the First 100 Years, and the extent to which in an era before internet, before modern communication technologies of any kind, the extent to which U.S. influence was interweaved with the Chinese national government is really quite stunning. But it wasn't just that. We did have I think the main U.S. imperialist action in China would be the suppression of the Boxer Rebellion around the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. We were part of the 8-nation coalition that crushed that rebellion. We did get a slice of the reparations for that rebellion, but rather quickly, within 4 or 5 years, we started turning those reparations back to China, or at least a large proportion of them back to China. And we really wanted to work with China. This extended to World War II, and FDR in particular was very interested in supporting Chiang Kai-shek's national government against the Japanese, not quite to the same extent, but with a lot of scarce resources supporting with Lend-Lease and other programs. We were supporting Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists, not to the same extent, but in the similar ways to ways we were supporting Joseph Stalin's fight against the Nazis in Russia or Winston Churchill's United Kingdom. And I think it was FDR in particular insisted that China have one of the cherished Security Council seats in the United Nations. So that was 5 nations, and is that? Oh gosh, that's a weird thing to brain fart on. It's 5 countries, right? Or is it 6 countries, permanent members of the UN Security Council? Regardless, FDR insisted that China be one of them, and he insisted throughout the World War II conflict, where it would have been easy, and there were a lot of people in the U.S. government, and certainly in our imperialist allies, that would have preferred to treat China as sort of a secondary, frankly, through a bunch of racist instincts, would have wanted to see China as somehow lesser. The United States insisted on putting China on the same level as Russia, France, and the United Kingdom after World War II. So the United States really felt like, I think, and to some extent, reasonably, felt like we had supported the Chinese. We were helping the Chinese resist imperialism. The Japanese, I think, very, very, very realistically, we were, even before World War II. And a little less legitimately, we thought that we'd help them resist British and French and German imperialism as well. So when the Chinese Civil War ended in 1949 with a communist victory and with all of our Christian nationalist allies skedaddling to Taiwan, we felt really, really betrayed by China and the Chinese people more broadly. And I think that's the origin of this weird fascination with keeping Taiwan, a small island off of China, somehow, and this is, of course, caveated or whatever, but like to some extent, U.S. territory or in the U.S. camp. In the early years of the Cold War, this was fairly straightforward because we did not have contact with China. I mean, I'm sure there were some contacts, but we did not have official diplomatic contact with the Chinese mainland. We, in fact, pretended that Taiwan, the government of these Christian nationalists in Taiwan, were the government of China up until the 1970s, which was rather ridiculous in retrospect, but kind of makes sense if you dive in a little bit to U.S. attitudes in the 1940s. I'm not sure if you guys have heard of the John Birch Society. It is I guess less influential now, but it was a very influential, very conservative, hyper-nationalist interest group or sect or cult or what have you during the U.S. Cold War. The John Birch Society is sort of, they were racist. They were very problematic. William F. Buckley, the sort of father of modern movement conservatism, one of his moves was to push the John Birch Society out into the margins or what have you. But they were very influential in early Cold War thought or what have you. And John Birch, the guy that the society is named after, is a Christian missionary and I think member of the precursor to the CIA who was killed by Chinese communists. So the John Birch Society in the mid 1940s. So the John Birch Society saw him as sort of like this first victim of the Cold War. So anger at the communists, and certainly we had very strong disputes with the Soviets, stronger disputes, it turns out, in the way that it played out in the 1970s with Nixon and whatnot. But there was this sense of betrayal, certainly a sort of racist sense that the Chinese were somehow alien and different, whereas the Russians shared a lot of cultural touchstones with the United States in the 20th century. I'm not entirely certain what the third one was, but these are sort of aspects in why the United States was so committed to Taiwan. The sort of sense of betrayal, broader sense of racism, what have you. Things got really weird in the 1970s because, for once, this is something that we rarely have that rarely happens. We had sort of somewhat rational people in charge of the presidency and the national security architecture in the United States. Yes, I am saying that Richard Nixon and Kissinger were really some of the only halfway rational people we've had leading the U.S. foreign policy apparatus like ever. Not to say that they weren't making horrific genocidal choices in places like Bangladesh, Cambodia, etc., but they were at least doing it in service to a plausible approach to things. And one of the very key neglected parts in U.S. victory in the Cold War was the fact that in the 1970s, the United States decided to get Chairman Mao specifically, because Mao was still alive at that point, and the Chinese Communist Party on the U.S. side. In the era of the Korean War, before the death of Stalin, the Soviet Union and China sort of marched in lockstep. The Chinese Communist Party under Mao, again, really didn't like the way that the Soviet Union Communist Party distanced itself from Stalinist approaches. So they were, I think by the 1960s, they were having border skirmishes, the Soviet Union and the United States, the Soviet Union and China, which shared a much larger border back then. And Nixon and Kissinger were like, hey, let's take advantage of this. And so Nixon famously went to China in 1972. Obviously, nothing was immediate about this. I did not dive into the morass of communiques and treaties and actually, maybe there aren't any treaties and internal U.S. congressional decisions, but across the 1970s, the United States went back and forth and sort of carefully measured, and that's sort of where across the Nixon and Carter administrations, and I guess Ford as well, the policy of strategic ambiguity was born. The idea was, well, obviously, working with China to defeat the Soviets is if we care at all about the Cold War, that is in the U.S. national interest. But there still was this really deep-seated sense of anger. Losing China in 1949 to the communists is sort of the central trauma of the U.S. Cold Warrior mindset. So many of the idiotic things that we did, like the war in Vietnam, were rooted in this this complex that the Cold Warriors and the U.S. public in general had over losing China. And that was, all of that was poured in to this obsession with defending Taiwan. The course of relations between the United States and China has always been rocky, but I think it got a lot rockier under Biden and Trump. To dive back into sort of the beginning here, there have been 3 Taiwan Strait crises. And those actually, that's, trying to, okay, so we're in the 1970s. We've decided that we're going to have a policy of strategic ambiguity. This essentially means that the United States is staying committed to the one China policy that we had been in for the Cold War up until that point. Our policy was that there was one China and Taiwan was in charge of it. We essentially didn't give up on the idea that Taiwan could win this civil war at any point in this period between 1949 and 1972. So we retained our one China policy. We just decided to be somewhat more ambiguous about who was in charge of that government. We established full diplomatic relations with Communist China. We gave Communist China that Security Council seat. But at the same time, there was legislation, I think the Taiwan Relations Act, 1979, that held that while we would not violate China's ideas about their control of Taiwan in certain important ways, we wouldn't send government officials, we wouldn't officially recognize Taiwanese officials. We would continue to arm the place. We would continue through a variety of weird bureaucratic face-saving workarounds, continue to work with the Taiwanese government, continue to fund the Taiwanese government, continuing to arm the Taiwanese government. So it was just this very strange sort of back and forth. And I think that policy of strategic ambiguity has worked out extraordinarily well for both China and Taiwan and the United States. Taiwan is famously one of the richest countries on the planet per capita, and honestly, it's surprisingly significant just in raw terms. I think it's something like in the teens as far as import and export to the United States, which is kind of insane when you consider how small of a country it is. But the reason for this is Taiwan's participation in the China megagrowth story over the past 30 years. So they are all, they are very, very deeply connected. And I want to give all of this larger context because I think in Washington, D.C., there's a tendency to focus on like simple military aspects of this conflict. And it is not, we have in the United States we are stuck in this mindset because it has been true for almost 80 years now, or was, 30 years ago anyway. We're still stuck in this mindset where the United States has massive military dominance. As we'll get into shortly, that's gone back and forth, and we're saying maybe there's sort of military parity over the Taiwan Strait at this point, which is an argument you can make. I don't think it's a particularly good one, and I think it falls apart entirely when you consider the broader context that I am giving here. Like, Taiwan is to some extent like a country born out of U.S. resentment and a sense of betrayal. Taiwan does not exist without the United States. Now, Taiwan is a country of large population, fraction, pinprick compared to China, but it's significant population, significant economy, and yes, even though it was heavily fostered by the United States for ideological purposes, they do have a flourishing democracy that should be respected, and I think that the United States can and should, through the prism of strategic ambiguity, not really saying what we're doing here, continue to foster and defend and help Taiwan preserve these very positive aspects of its country as it evolves forward and closer to China. A really key point here is it's not China that's pushing for a war over the Taiwan Strait. It is the United States, because the United States perceives that our easy military dominance of this question is gone already, and our ability to really influence militarily what goes on in that particular China-Taiwan relationship is rapidly diminishing, rapidly fading away. It's the United States that is pushing for a war in Taiwan. It is the United States that is endangering Taiwanese democracy. It is the United States that is endangering Taiwan's economic miracle by pushing for this conflict. And it's not... This is a crucial thing. This is a first-term Trump and a Biden thing, more a Biden thing than a Trump thing, probably. The Obama administration was very interested in pivoting to China, competing with China, pivoting to Asia, competing with China, was putting together a set of packages that the United States probably should at this point to revise the U.S.-Chinese economic relationship. But he was very careful, as was Bush. As was Clinton after 1996, to not push on Taiwan at all. It is Trump and Biden that sort of introduced this issue that upset the apple cart and made a real military conflict over Taiwan seem like a real possibility. This is not China. China knows they're winning. China knows that Taiwan's natural destiny is with the United States, and I think that most U.S. analysts, Taiwan's natural destiny eventually is with China, and they just have to sit back and let it happen. And I think if you honestly look at most U.S. commentary and agitation on this topic, I think most U.S. experts know this too, especially in the context of the second Trump administration, where everything's up in the air and going crazy. So there have been, let's talk military, which definitely comes under the A2AD framework, the anti-access area denial. Um, in 1949, it seems to me that perhaps it wasn't quite as straightforward as I thought it was. It's actually only in the 1950s. Perhaps I thought that the U.S. Navy was defending the withdrawal from China in 1949 to Taiwan. It seems like it may not have been quite that straightforward. The Perhaps the Chinese Communist Party didn't have much of a navy and was in a lot of disarray as Taiwan was taking form. But by 1954, we get to the first Taiwan Strait crisis, and in that context, it absolutely is the U.S. Navy defending Taiwan to some extent, working with the Taiwanese government to help protect the existence of Taiwan. So that's by the mid 1950s. What's very interesting about the first Taiwan crisis is that actually did feature the Chinese communists taking more islands, taking territory that Taiwan had held onto. And I think that might be, I could be wrong about this, but I think that is the last serious change of territory between Taiwan and China. Taiwan still holds some islands that are very close to the Chinese coast. Um, so that was the first Straits crisis. And then in 1958, there was another that is, by some measures, more serious, had a more serious threat of nuclear war. China was more consolidated at this point, had presumably partially recovered from their immense efforts in the Korean War. And what's interesting about these two, the first two Taiwan Straits crises of the 1950s, is that they both involved sort of artillery shells. They both evolved. They both felt very World War II or even World War I in the details of the conflict. By 1996, and the third Taiwan Strait crisis, I think this was to some extent a China's reaction to the democratization of Taiwan, which was something that was happening in the 1990s. I recently did a video talking about how it's strangely coincidental that in the 1990s, when the United States was desperately looking for justifications to use its military after the end of the Cold War, all of a sudden Taiwan became a much more attractive democratic place, and I think those. I'm not undermining the idea that Taiwan is a legitimate democracy, but I do think that the timing there is more than coincidence. China didn't like that, and in the 1990s, 40 full years after the Straits crises. China was not sending artillery shells onto islands, and there are still Taiwanese-controlled islands that are very much in the artillery range of China. It was sending missiles. It was doing missile tests, and that is an indication of kind of where we are now. But also, that was 30 years ago, and thanks to the U.S. war on terror, everybody's been doing a whole bunch of military development since then. So this is the concept of anti-access area denial. I am obviously something of a dissident against most U.S. foreign policy approaches, but this anti-access area denial stuff, or A2AD as it was called, is straight out of Pentagon materials. This is what everybody was talking about this in defense circles about 15 years ago. And I don't think it ever stopped being true. The Pentagon just stopped talking about it because they didn't want to emphasize just how worthless the U.S. Navy was for any real conflict over Taiwan. So this is like bare bones. Everybody acknowledges this. This is anybody who's thought about this with any seriousness, has read more than a single foreign affairs article on this, knows that the U.S. Navy is now broadly useless in defending Taiwan. Submarines, different thing, but the surface Navy, the extraordinarily expensive destroyers, aircraft carriers, there's just nothing they can do here. And as a strategy to get money, The U.S. Navy and the Pentagon was very explicit about acknowledging this about 10, 15 years ago. You can just look at any foreign policy discussion of A2AD. They stopped talking about this because I think they followed the chart through. They were like, oh, of course, well, if we don't have enough money to do this incredibly difficult thing, then we need more money, was their argument. And I think probably a few too many came back and were like, well, I guess we just can't do this thing anymore, and I guess it's just the thing the United States isn't going to do. So the Pentagon stopped talking about A2AD about a decade ago. Because that very sensible argument that they made was followed through by other commentators in ways that they did not quite like. The way that A2AD is talked about at this point is the idea that, yes, it's true, the U.S. Navy cannot support a Taiwanese fight against China. However, there's 100 miles between China and Taiwan, and any Chinese attack on Taiwan would be so horrifically costly. So the United States is caught out by this in the, it can't get within 1,000 miles of China, but China can't get within 100 miles of Taiwan. So it's kind of the same thing. It is absolutely not the same thing. 100 miles is not 1,000 miles. China has nearly infinite capacity for manufacturing missiles and whatnot, and also the ability to have manufacturing that is out of the missile range of Taiwan. Like, it is not at all equal. It remains true, it is absolutely true, that a Chinese attempt to conquer Taiwan with an amphibious landing would be incredibly, ruinously difficult and challenging and horrifically costly to the Chinese. So you can say that at the military front, that on some degree, on the military dimension alone, we might be at some kind of stalemate here. On every other dimension, though, there's no stalemate here. And that's a key thing here, is that I don't believe the United States will be able to defend Taiwan militarily. And I also don't believe that scenario will ever come to pass. I believe that Taiwan's destiny is with China, and I believe that China will be able to take Taiwan completely peacefully. I think that's a really key just part of this that nobody ever talks about. I don't know if it's in the 2040s. I don't know if it's in the 2050s. If the United States, basically, if we start a war about this, that'll mean that Taiwan will be destroyed and China will get it sooner. I think if the United States just relaxes, then maybe Taiwan and China peacefully decide they have the same interests under our AI overlords in the 2060s. Or if we continue with this hostile path that Biden and Trump have been pushing, then maybe there is an actual war. And or also, maybe there's not a war, and China just decides to act coercively. Taiwan, economically, did absolutely have a serious... So the A2AD, I've made videos about this in the past. I've talked about it. And now we have Yemen. Because the Houthi government of Yemen decided to essentially militarily protest Israel's genocide in Gaza and shut down the Red Sea, the United States in early 2024, or was it even late 2023, decided to make the Houthis pay, stop them, free up the Red Sea, guarantee freedom of navigation. And the United States utterly failed, completely failed, at enormous cost. There's a Wall Street Journal article I keep going back to where somebody in the U.S. government admitted openly that 600 exchanges of fire, it was something like 400 missiles that we had sent and like 200 interceptions we had done, had cost $1 billion to the U.S. Navy. Keep in mind, this is for a complete failure. The Houthis blocked the Red Sea, to commercial traffic up until the ceasefire in January of 2025. So a complete failure. And the U.S. Navy expended $1 billion worth of munitions to deal with 600 interactions with the Houthi government. The Houthi government of Yemen is an impressive group. They have begun to manufacture their own drones and missiles or what have you, but they are orders of magnitude, like an order of magnitude of orders of magnitude. I don't know if that's math, but like exponentially smaller missile manufacturing capacity than the Chinese have. So I think the whole A2AD thing was in the realm of theory because nobody had had a serious war. The U.S. Navy has now been completely humiliated in Yemen, and it has now become blindingly obvious that there is no possibility of the United States defending Taiwan. All right, so on to economics. Since Trump and especially Biden decided to escalate the Taiwan issue, so Trump, in his first, I think in 2016, chose to phone call and congratulate the Taiwanese president, which is a real no-no under the old policy of strategic ambiguity. This was in 2016. There were other actions that he took, and he, I believe, greenlit U.S. soldiers on Taiwan, which is a huge problem for the Chinese government. I saw that towards the end of the Trump administration. I just saw those actions alone as extraordinary escalatory and really bad. And they were nothing compared to what the Biden administration would give. I think he got a little more disciplined once he had first one and then two wars on his hands in Ukraine and Gaza. But in the early years of the Biden administration, he couldn't give an interview where he didn't discard strategic ambiguity and talk about how he wanted to defend Taiwan. This was diligently walked back by Blinken and his people every time he did it. But it was really insulting and dangerous way to speak about Taiwan, and importantly, a complete break with U.S. precedent. And of course, Nancy Pelosi went and did a whole tour hanging out with Taiwanese folks. I mean, really just a huge escalation. And during the Biden escalation, a lot of efforts were made to actually step up trade between Taiwan and the United States. Taiwan Semiconductor Corporation is now opening a facility in Arizona, things like that. But still, it's just so very clear that that Taiwan is very intimately connected with China. These figures, I got different figures everywhere, but this is the U.S. International Trade Administration. This is a section of the U.S. government that still has a website up, which is nice, that holds. This is U.S. International Trade Administration. This is the best possible way to look at the issues. China, mainland China, and Hong Kong account for 30% of total Taiwan trade. And I am pretty sure that's a drastic underestimate because the 10% of Taiwan's total trade that is with Japan, I assume is a lot of sort of Taiwan being an intermediary between the Japanese and the Chinese economy. Taiwan is tremendously economically dependent on China. Taiwanese businesses own billions, tens of billions, perhaps hundreds of billions of dollars worth of equipment and factories in China. So much of Taiwan's economy is tremendously reliant on the mainland China. And that's sort of the I would love, and I think it's possible for China and Taiwan to have a completely non-coercive reunion. I do not think that China will militarily conquer Taiwan, but that does not mean that I don't think there will be a coercive taking of Taiwan by China. The coercive taking of Taiwan by China would be purely economic. The Chinese government has the scope to do not a physical blockade, but merely an economic blockade, a sanctioning of Taiwan by China, of the nature that the United States does towards Cuba or Syria or Iran or Venezuela, would be devastating for Taiwan. And a simple appropriation of all of the equipment and factories that Taiwan owns in China might be the mere threat of that might be enough to get Taiwan to be on board with some kind of unification. And like we've worked incredibly hard over the past 4 years to make that not the case, and we've made barely a dent in the economic interweaving of China and Taiwan. Also, obviously, there's a lot of cultural affinities. Taiwan speaks Mandarin and Cantonese, just like China does. They have the same history up until 1949. Like, it's just, this is sort of the bigger context. So you can say that there is, by really fudging the numbers a bit, there is some equality between the United States and China on the A2AD front, on the inability of military conquest or what have you. But beyond that, there's just nothing. It gets a lot less possible. So that's the economic, the social, the political. And the key thing is how quickly this is changing and evolving. As the United States keeps starting wars and providing more and more testing grounds for equipment, I think the missile thing was something we knew about at great length in 10, 15 years ago. But missiles at least are expensive. Drones are not. Militarized drones mean that China's capacity, which was already extraordinarily damaging with missiles, and now there are drones. And of course, the hybridization between missiles and drones. Is it a missile? Is it a drone? And the manufacturing economies of scale that China is going to be able to take advantage of. This is only going to accelerate. It's simply only going to accelerate. I see somebody asking, what do you say about what if, the United States has to keep defending Ukraine to dissuade China from going for China for going for Taiwan? The U.S. wants this fight. China does not. I think that's a really key thing. So much stuff like, oh, China's doing all this terrible stuff. They're violating Taiwan's airspace. You look at a map and yeah, they probably know they're being a little inflammatory, but they're not flying over Taiwan. They're flying over a incredibly aggressive definition of Taiwan's airspace that I think extends to mainland Chinese territory. It's just China knows they're gonna win this. So why would they want to do some kind of gross military adventure that costs 3 million lives in the 2030s when they can just have Taiwan for free in the 2040s? And this is key. So China is not growing the way it was in the 1990s or the aughts or up until 2015, 2016 ago. It'll never grow that way again. There would have to be extraordinary breakthroughs to allow that to happen. I do think with some intelligent management in the United States, there's even scope, in my lifetime for the United States to be growing faster than China does. None of that's going to matter because, I don't know if I'd graph this somehow. The interweaving, the proximity of Taiwan to China, the further interweaving of the Chinese and Taiwanese economies is inevitable. It is happening day by day. We are watching it happen, even if China only grows at 4% a year going forward, or 3%. That's going to continue to happen. And the military technology is going to push the balance further and further in China's favor. And that's if the United States figures out how to grow economically better than China does again. Which is, probably unlikely to happen. So it doesn't matter that China's economic growth miracle era is over. They're going to continue growing like a modern developed country, and that alone is going to push Taiwan further and further into China's orbit. Um, there's some indication in the second Trump administration, and who effing knows, that Trump is open to some kind of broader deal with Xi Jinping in China, is less interested in outright belligerence than he used to be. He loves to make deals, and China is the biggest possible place to make deals with. There's been some really horrified speculation in U.S. foreign policy circles that he might be trying to figure out some accommodation with China, and that sounds fine to me. The United States won't be able to defend Taiwan. The United States should not try to defend Taiwan. But the attitudes of the Biden administration and the foreign policy community more broadly were incredibly dangerous and always had the risk of prompting this horrific Chinese invasion of Taiwan that would destroy Taiwan, that would destroy China, would probably sink a couple U.S. aircraft carriers before we were like, well, F that. And we would like to avoid that, of course. But I think that thus far the Trump administration seems less likely to prompt that than the Biden administration. So in that respect, I'm pleased to see that. The other real key thing, and I guess this is what we'll close with, about the Trump administration is so that trajectory, even if China has a year with no growth or whatever, even if China has a broader crisis related to its demographics or its weird governing system, or rebelling against the lack of rampaging economic growth, what have you, it's still pretty inevitable that that Taiwan is going to get closer to China. We're running out of time, and I think this is why the first Trump administration and especially the Biden administration became so aggressive on the Taiwan issue. We're running out of time to have this war, and to really have a serious commitment to defending Taiwan would require focus from Washington, D.C. Probably would have required this before the war on terror. We probably lost Taiwan forever with Bush's choice to piss away $6 trillion in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's probably the point at which Taiwan became completely impossible to defend by the United States. But certainly, Trump that wants to do tariffs on Canada and Mexico, wants to throw over our relationship with NATO, wants to conquer Greenland or retake the Panama Canal, to seriously defend Taiwan from China. Not that I think that's really a worthwhile thing to do, to sort of keep that imperial outpost for the rest of our lives. Bush needed to have not done the war on terror, and we need to be completely in lockstep with all of our allies. This has not been the case, even under Biden. This has not been the case at any point during this century, frankly. And I think that, as with a lot of things, this chaotic second Trump administration is going to represent the abandoning of a lot of old, stupid ideas. And one of those old, stupid ideas is that the United States is going to fight for Taiwan. So yeah, I hope that is, I think that is what I have to say. That's the presentation. And just in time, I have my first super chat from PF Young, a very generous super chat. Thank you so much. For the duration of this presentation, which is about an hour, I'm going to do Q&A. I'm going to answer whatever questions you might have about anything. We can talk about China. We can talk about the new Trump administration and my sort of ambivalent reaction to it thus far, and my lack of understanding of how I'm going to position myself and how I'm going to talk about it. But as we go forward, I will answer every question that comes with a super chat, which PF Young provided. I will, we got Deep Noetics here. It's great. There's lots of fun folks here. Deep Noetics has a YouTube channel that discusses things discusses very interesting things, and he was kind enough to have me over there recently for a discussion. PF Young, is it PF Young or PF Jung? I'm sorry. But has left a super chat, very generous super chat, saying, I watched your conversation with JJ. Please continue to keep him informed on the relationship between Israel and the United States. JJ McCullough is a popular Canadian YouTuber. Man, I really want to. I'm just realizing I'm behind on his videos. I really need to check those out because I'm sure he's got interesting things to say on recent developments of the Trump administration. I found JJ to be pretty, in our conversation, I found JJ to be pretty clear-eyed about what Israel's doing. But I think he is a little more, I just don't think he holds himself out as a foreign policy focused guy. So I think he's a little more cautious about his engagement with that issue, and has made a completely rational decision that I made for much of the history of this channel, saying, I'm just not going to engage with this Israel stuff. Of course, over the past year, and part of my, depression, is that too strong a word? But sort of dismay about my job over the past now year and a half, has been the fact that I have no choice but to engage with Israel's genocide in Gaza. If you look at that conversation that JJ and I had, I mean, he's pretty clear-eyed that, Israel's doing horrible things, doesn't dispute it at all when I say it, but I think he, with his own particular audience and his own particular approach to issues, has decided that the genocide in the Middle East is not a hill he wants to die on. We occasionally exchange messages. Israel doesn't come up much because he just doesn't cover Israel much. I'm glad folks enjoyed my conversation with JJ, and I'd be very excited if that meant that people were coming here. Thank you so much for that generous super chat. PF Jung or Young. Rob, are you as excited as I am about Tulsi Gabbard being confirmed as the DNI? No. Look, I love the idea of a somewhat dissident person. This is the sort of the constant tension between, and it almost serves like the deep state, the old establishment, by seeing what we've seen a lot of over the past couple weeks and months, is people who are a little unbalanced in their approach to things, becoming the sort of the standard bearer of change and revolution, and then inevitably that becoming a real problem. So you know what? Maybe Tulsi Gabbard will be amazing. I was, like many, thrilled to Tulsi Gabbard's, I think was it a 2020 or was it earlier, presidential run for the Democrats, because she did speak seriously about the failures of regime change wars, U.S. Overstatements. I guess her choice to go meet with Assad looks a lot worse in retrospect now that he's clearly a loser. But I think that that was a really sensible intervention in the U.S. foreign policy of the time, and the sort of thing that we should celebrate rather than denigrate. And the fact that she did actually make it past the confirmation of Trump's national security appointments at the top level, at the level that needs to be confirmed, she's certainly among my favorites. But I'm not really that excited about it, because, and this is specifically, I think this was during her campaign, she did a couple videos that were just like talking about a potential civil war in the United States, and it's frustrating to me that I do consider myself a sort of legitimate dissident against U.S. foreign policy and U.S. government approaches, and it's really irritating to me that a lot of people that I agree with feel the need to go further. This is a classic quibble. Perhaps I should be more excited about Tulsi Gabbard's confirmation, but I don't expect too much. The Trump administration, let's see how things consolidate. Let's see how things shake out. It's funny. Somebody asked me, what is the main thing? I think, Rory asked me in one of the podcasts, what would be your fondest hope out of the Trump administration, and a continued ceasefire in Gaza. If Trump is now rounding almost a month without genocide in Gaza. I think it's, there's an interpretation. It's probably a little too sunny, but you could suggest that in fact you could suggest that some of the more ridiculous things that Trump has been proposing have been working as a way to help pressure people in the United States and Israel to keep the ceasefire going. If Trump is up there saying, "Oh yeah, we're going to take over Gaza, we're going to build some building, we're going to build a resort, and all the Gazans are going to go to Egypt or whatever," he can say stuff like that while also pressuring Israel to keep the ceasefire. The only question, Israel has been kicking and screaming throughout this ceasefire. They want to go genocide and genocide harder. And I think that the Trump administration has kept them going. It was pretty clear this week. We got some back and forth about Hamas was like, look, Israel's not honoring any of these things. We're not going to push back we're not going to give you the hostages because Israel's not doing any of these things. And in the Biden administration, that would have meant that the ceasefire would have fallen apart. In the Trump administration, we get Trump saying absolutely balls out, genocidal, insane stuff, but the bombs don't start again. Maybe that's too sunny an interpretation of what Trump is doing, but we'll see. I think more will be revealed. Malta asks, if the Trump administration keeps going right now, will there even be state capacity to defend Guam? I think that's a really interesting question. And I think this gets to like a broader question. It's like how much military capacity the United States actually need. I would argue it's vastly less than what we have. I felt like kind of on Twitter, I felt like kind of a goofy like MAGA Trump supporter recently, off of like what are meant to be outrageous quotes. There are, what's his name, Aaron Rupar. His entire job is to make clips of, does he work for Vox? His entire job is to make clips of things that Trump said that seem outrageous. Or funny, he's not entirely, he's mostly to make things that sound outrageous and scary and sad. And Trump, and some of the clips he's had over the past week past couple of days have been stuff like Trump said he wants to cut nukes he wants to talk with Putin to cut nukes. I'm like, oh, that sounds great. And then a broader discussion of a conversation with China and Russia about cutting our militaries. Our militaries are so huge. And like Aaron Rupar was like, oh no. And I'm like, what? This sounds amazing. Whether Trump is actually capable of any of that, of course, is a broader question. We have definitely seen him, to a surprising extent and a disturbing extent, go after elements of the U.S. government. We have yet to see any serious efforts at cutting the Pentagon. Amusingly or horrifyingly, I think I did a short on this, but basically he can't cut the Pentagon because the Pentagon has never been audited and nobody knows where the money is. Makes it a lot more difficult for Elon Musk and Doge. Star Pulsaro, the super chat, says, do you think the CCP will go the way of the KMT did in the 1980s, give up power but be a political party in a new democratic China? This is standard. One of the greatest props of the Chinese Communist Party is U.S. attitudes and U.S. aggression. I think that the CCP kind of was going that way. The CCP before Xi Jinping and at the beginning of the Xi Jinping era, we were beginning to talk about sort of public disputes within the Chinese Communist Party as if it were becoming a more normal party, more factionalized. I think, was it the PRI sort of did that? There were factions within Mexico's 80-year ruling party, one-party state. I guess 1920 to 2000. Yeah, 80 years China had so Mexico had a one-party government called the PRI, the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, the Institutional Revolutionary Party. And then there were factions within the PRE and then the PRI. and then eventually different parties. And we were seeing the development of that in 2010, 11. And I think it's not just this. There are natural authoritarian, totalitarian instincts within China, but certainly exacerbated by Obama's pivot to Asia. We had Xi Jinping come in, and, we were talking about Bo Xilai, who was the mayor of, or the guy in charge of Chongqing, a large interior Chinese city, China's Chicago or what have you. Being talked about as having more open political competition to be the next leader of China. And then, of course, Xi Jinping, the princeling, came in and through a corruption, and I don't doubt that Bo Xilai and others were corrupt, but through corruption proceedings, took all of that out. And I do think that was related to some extent to the pivot to Asia. I think the CCP, it's much like the U.S. Pentagon, its main justification for its continued dominance of everything is fear. And fear of the United States is entirely rational, especially the way that Trump and Biden have been acting. Do I think, I would love that. I think it would be amazing if the CCP, democratized. I think at this point, it's we're waiting for the death of Xi Jinping, who has set himself up as president for life. And what's going to happen then? Xi Jinping is 71 years old. I think he could, I don't know what his, does anybody have any indication of what Xi Jinping's state of health is? We live in the 21st century. A 71-year-old could be in power for another 3 years, or he could be in power for another 25 years. It's hard to say. So I think, Xi Jinping doesn't have to die of natural causes. He just has to retire. So who knows? Is Xi Jinping going to hang on into his late 70s? Don't know. I'll confess that Sarah, I have not made a huge, devoted a ton of mental energy to, we used to call it Kremlinology during the Cold War, which was a mocking title. It was, you're basically just, trying to judge moonbeams and farts, trying to understand what's going on in a very opaque, non-democratic system. So I would love it if the CCP went the way of the KMT to give up power but be a political party in New Democratic China. But that seems like a huge lift, and a much bigger lift than it was in Taiwan. Keep in mind that Taiwan is incredibly dependent on an outside sponsor in the United States. So the United States was putting that pressure very strongly on the KMT to make Taiwan more of a attractive. If Taiwan was just still a little crappy Kuomintang dictatorship today, it would be a lot harder to sell the idea of defending Taiwan to the extent that we can. And China doesn't have that pressure. In fact, it has the opposite U.S. pressure, which is a constant threat of U.S. imperialism, that the CCP can actually make a somewhat credible case that they are good at standing in the way of that sort of thing and defending China. So while I do think China and Taiwan are very similar, one scenario that I kind of love is that actually there is some kind of dynamic crisis in China, and the Chinese people sort of invite in the Taiwanese government and elites. That's an amusing to govern a unified country. That is the nightmare scenario for the United States, but and the Pentagon for sure. But not an impossibility. Questions. I am on live chat, not the. Local Extreme says, "Yeah, Putin isn't cutting nukes." Why not? I think there is. It's real hard to lie about cutting nukes. These are big installations. It is incredibly deeply in Russia's interest to spend less money on nuclear weapons. And it's certainly in the U.S. interest, but it's much more in Russia's interest. Russia has, as long as it's got a couple thousand nukes, active nukes, it can end the world. This is the dynamic. I mean, Ronald Reagan ran as the hawk of the Uber hawks. He called the Soviet Union evil. Everybody was terrified that he was going to end the world, and he ended up doing, I believe, more serious disarmament work than any U.S. president before or since. There's a simple fact that, like, once you get to a point where you can annihilate human civilization, and I believe both the United States and Russia are like 4 to 5 to 10 times beyond that, there's plenty of scope for arms limitation. So I don't necessarily see why Putin wouldn't cut nukes. However, what makes Loga absolutely correct, like I think real disarmament requires a context where NATO and the United States aren't actively at war in Ukraine, and a number of other things that aren't going to happen. I don't believe that the United States is, even after peace with Ukraine and Russia, I don't think the United States is likely to remove most of the sanctions that we've got against Russia at this point. And yeah, it is kind of hard to believe that there would be a disarmament deal while we are sanctioning Russia. Sarah Jessica Farter, it's a great name, says, LOL, Rupar framed the military spending and nukes comments as negative. I came across them via your Twitter feed and viewed them positively, but sadly also unrealistic. Rupar is annoying. I think Rupar's job is to find crazy things that Trump says. And I do think, I don't know what was in Rupar's heart specifically, but I did see people on Twitter flipping out about this, like it was a horrible thing. How dare you? Mahathir is 100 this year. Loga is referring to Mohammed Mahathir, who was the long time, I think, first strongman and then actually democratically elected leader of Malaysia, who came back to power at some point in the last decade, right, in his 90s, briefly, which is kind of crazy. Was that after the blow up of the regime Khan? Anyway, Malaysian politics, as Loga well knows, is not something I'm as good on as I should be. But Mahathir Mohamad is a great example of, if you give a man power, he will live for f***ing ever. And unfortunately, I think Xi Jinping is likely to be, is quite possibly going to be an example of that. Not that I wish, ill on Xi Jinping personally. I just think it's time for China to have new leadership. Humzu, thank you for the super chat. How will Japan and the Koreas deal with the changing political situation between U.S. and China? In the long term, are they more of a Chinese ally? I would say no. Korea is potentially... Well, the beauty of Korea from the U.S. perspective is that Korea has North Korea there. And North Korea, certainly through U.S. pressure, but also because it is a profoundly sick monarchical system, is a nightmare dumpster fire basket case. So, like, in the context of like complete peace and amity between China and Japan and South Korea is always going to want the United States there, in barring, truly revolutionary possibilities like a nuclear war or like some kind of reunification, some kind of collapse of the it's the Kim family, right? I always mess up the last names, first name stuff with Asian countries. So Korea is always sort of going to be on our side. Japan, keep in mind, we militarily occupied Japan. And they have done for 80 years because of the Chinese threat. They really want us there. There are so many, it's really hard to imagine Japan's orientation towards China changing that dramatically. Who knows? The United States gets bogged down in another horrific war with Iran, and perhaps a younger generation of Japanese politicians are just like, why are we doing this again? I think an interesting thought experiment is, for decades or half a century out, is what happens. One of the greatest defeats of China this decade has to have been their crushing of Hong Kong. One China, two systems was a system that was working for Hong Kong and for China, and I think the paranoia and Yeah, I'm not saying it's rational or good that the Chinese Communist Party has been able to leverage U.S. aggression um, to become much more authoritarian and crush. I think that's an actively bad thing, and one of the really dumb things that China did was come in after 25 years and squash real elements of Hong Kong's autonomy. Hong Kong did not pose a real threat. Yeah, some dumbasses were waving American flags in protests, but fundamentally, like, if the United States can't defend Taiwan, how are we going to take over Hong Kong? And crushing that two systems thing really pushed off Chinese and Taiwanese reunification by decades. What if, an interesting thought experiment would be, what if Xi Jinping hadn't killed the golden goose in Hong Kong? And then, at some point in the 2030s, Taiwan jumps in with the one country, two systems. In the fullness of time, a more secure, richer China decides to experiment with more democratic options. Of course, the problem with Chinese-Japanese relations is that even coming up on a century after Japanese imperialism was defeated by the United States, when and some of this is Chinese Communist Party manipulation, but as we've seen everywhere, from Myanmar to other places, when more democracy gets introduced, Europe, more nationalism naturally comes to the fore, and the tension between Japan and China is so immense that it's hard for me to imagine Japan and China being friendly. And this is, of course, to the great detriment of Japanese and Chinese security, that they can't get it together to get over older crimes and provide an inlet for the United States that wishes nothing but destruction on both their countries, frankly. Wow, okay, that's another super chat, and nobody has said anything since. I guess I'll look for other questions. What do you think about China Uncensored and the news on China's collapse in 5 seconds? Okay, so China Uncensored is very interesting. It's been a decade since I've watched them. They're obviously heavily funded. Are they still running? Is it still that same guy? I think there is a space for, as I guess I'm part of.
Silicon Valley.
Yeah, it's still the same guy. 2 million subscribers on China Uncensored. It is, I think, more or less explicitly, is it Falun Gong or not, China Uncensored? It is quite explicitly anti-Chinese reporting. And propaganda, might be a little too strong, but it is deeply adversarial reporting on China, like they hate the communists, and they attempt to have a sense of humor about it, that sort of thing. M. Harry says Falun Gong, total Falun Gong propaganda of China Uncensored. China doesn't have adversarial press, and I firmly believe in the adversarial press. It'd be nice if we had an America Uncensored that had a larger audience, frankly. I believe in combative adversarial press, and while obviously China Uncensored is heavily funded, like the Epoch Times, by people with an agenda, it is still adversarial press about a system that has no adversarial press. So it's hard for me to get very angry at China Uncensored. I think you should know when you watch China Uncensored that it is paid for by people who deeply, deeply hate the current Chinese government and would like it to be overthrown. You should know that, but that doesn't mean that everything they say is dishonest or incorrect. And I think if China had a more vibrant and open media sphere itself, they'd be better positioned to refute whatever it is that China Uncensored says that may not be true. Dark Lord Sauron says, "Hi Rob, I love your videos," which is interesting to hear from the Dark Lord. It's funny. I don't know if any of you live in New York City, but are you familiar with the Mordor? The Brooklyn has a very significant skyline now. There was just one building called the Williamsburg Savings Bank that was put up, I don't know, 80, 100 years ago. That was sort of like the one tall building when I first started coming to New York in my 20s. But over the past 20 years, they built up a whole new skyline. And now the dominating largest building in Brooklyn that is very visible from most of lower Manhattan is this big black spike that looks like the Eye of Sauron. And it's just kind of funny that that's always just looking down on me when I'm in lower Manhattan, traveling around New York City. Not sure why I wanted to mention that. Epoch Times CFO got arrested in a money laundering operation. It's embarrassing. Same guys have... oh, really? The same guys have America Uncovered, but I have no clue about it. I assume it's talking about how amazing America is and how China should learn from it. I specifically, I don't think that China Uncensored are the people I'd want to go to for my adversarial reporting on the United States. Professor Membrane says that China Uncensored has strongly denied funding from Falun Gong. And that's entirely possible. There are other wealthy Taiwanese and Chinese diaspora people who could also fund it. It is pretty clear that China Uncensored is not about providing balanced news of China. It is about providing news that undermines the Chinese government, which is, I think, a perfectly legitimate thing to do. I wish we had more of that sort of thing in the United States, undermining the United States government. America Uncovered became far right the moment the leader of Falun Gong became a Trump fan. Interesting. Bear says, honestly, you can get on Douyin and Chinese social media to get a feel of the environment. Just what I need. Another social media app to manage. I guess I will scroll up for more questions. This live stream has a lot of snippets that make it look like you are China pilled. Yeah, I'm very open to that accusation, and I think those kinds of accusations are going to get stronger and stronger. It's been kind of amazing how. No, I'm not saying that I am China pilled, but I know that I'm going to continue to get accused of being China pilled. Or paid for by China, that sort of thing. It's really been disturbing to see the way that free speech has been crushed in the United States related to the topic of the genocide in Gaza. I am free to say that there's a genocide in Gaza, as any open-minded person who's done any research can say, but it's really hard to do that in the United States right now if you work for any kind of organization, and crucially and shockingly, if you work for a university. So yeah, I'm completely independent. I am doing my YouTube thing, and I can say whatever I want. I feel like my YouTube channel's already been crushed years ago, and I think it's entirely possible that it'll be crushed more. But yeah, no, I am firmly committed to the idea that the United States is a free country and we should be able to say whatever we want. And it's pretty obvious in, I'd say, my fairly voluminous research on U.S.-China relations that it's the United States that wants a war over Taiwan, not China. China is a very powerful, wealthy country with a lot to recommend it, but in the final analysis has, at this point in time, has almost no influence on the progress of world politics, geopolitics, and even the U.S.-China relationship. So this idea that China is the answer to everything, China is responsible for everything, China is the villain everywhere, is, whenever I see or hear that, it's just an excuse. It strikes me as just an excuse to avoid dealing with the United States' real internal problems. It's U.S. internal problems, our oligarchs, our costs of living. Those are the true threat to the United States, not China, which is not a particularly impressive rival yet. Rob is not China pilled. He's America pilled. Thank you. Off topic, why did the King of Jordan allow himself to have that press conference where he was deeply humiliated by Trump? I mean, was he deeply humiliated by Trump? I mean, he essentially manipulated Trump from um, strident, repeated demand that Jordan and Egypt take all the Palestinians to a pretty weak, well, I'll take 2,000 injured kids or what have you. I think that was honestly a kind of impressive feat of managing up on the King of Jordan's part, frankly. Jordan is a phenomenally weak country. It is has been designed to be weak and stabilized in its borders by the British. Fundamentally destabilized by waves of Palestinian refugees from Israel, and also fundamentally destabilized by the war in Syria and sanctions on Syria. I mean, imagine being a fairly poor, landlocked desert country that hasn't been allowed to deal with one of your neighbors economically for a decade. Like, I'm continually amazed. Egypt, a much larger and wealthier country, I'm impressed and amazed that it continues to exist, that government. But Jordan even more so. So yeah, I don't know that. I mean, I think Jordan is just by its nature in a pretty humiliating position, CinemaTube. So yeah, and I didn't see that as any more humiliating than what Jordan normally has to put up with. So yeah. How do you think the Saudi-hosted World Cup in 2034 is going to go? They've pledged to spend $1 billion to construct a stadium. What do you think? I still maintain, running out of time, only 5 years to go, but I stand by my prediction. I do not expect Saudi Arabia to exist in 2030 under the Saudis. Whether the new government will be unified enough to actually host a World Cup, I think, is an interesting question. Crazy Pupil, do you think Elon and other oligarchs being so involved with China is a moderating influence? Yes, I do. But that doesn't mean I'm happy about Elon and the other oligarchs, despite how much I've profited off of Tesla stock over the years. I'm getting really... Yeah, I just don't know what direction I'm going in at this point, but I do kind of wonder if it might be a sort of morphing into an I guess there's not a lot of scope for morphing into an anti-Google YouTube channel on YouTube owned by Google. Maybe I'll just go after all the other oligarchs. It's a real problem for the United States, Elon and the oligarchs. I don't doubt that Elon and the other oligarchs sort of stepping out and having their own independent foreign policies with China, absolutely a moderating influence. And I think outside of the tech bubble, also sort of financial titans and the decisions they make, Wall Street types, have also been important in moderating China's reactions to things that the United States does. But that does not mean I think it is a good thing to have, more broadly, to have oligarch-dominated governance. Jan asks, who will be the next president? I assume of the United States in 2028. I do not think it'll be Elon Musk. I think that despite all of the experience thus far, I'm not selling my Tesla stock. I do think that Elon Musk has got a real comeuppance coming. Some people think he'd be the next president. I think that's currently illegal, but if we conquered Canada, where he does have citizenship, where he was born. I don't think it'll be Elon Musk. I think J.D. Vance. Haven't been hearing a lot about J.D. Vance these past weeks, but it's a long 4 years. The Democrats really need to start cultivating younger and more combative folks. I think probably the Trump administration will end in disaster, as the first one did, and it'll probably be a Democrat. I haven't really come up with this myself. I've read analysis that makes me think it's pretty likely that we will alternate between Republican and Democratic presidents sort of every 4 years until the United States gets its shit together and grows out of this oligarch dominance. And we're kind of like in the Gilded Age right now. And what happens in the Gilded Age is people are never really very happy other than the very wealthy. And then eventually, as would happen with Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, eventually somebody comes in to power who does something about the oligarchic dominance of the U.S. polity. And until we get to that point, I think the Republicans and Democrats are going to go back and forth. I think the current Trump push has been very pro-oligarch. I think it's sort of the extreme indication. It's the government. The government is the problem. It's definitely the government, even though that has been the operating assumption of both the Republican and Democratic parties for 5 decades now. This is like the most extreme instantiation of it yet, and I think people are going to be very disappointed to find how few U.S. problems it actually solves, rolling back more of FDR's administrative state. And I don't know, are we just going to destroy all these things and not rebuild anything? Seems likely. Thoughts on a Jon Stewart run? I think Jon Stewart would certainly be as capable of taking the office as Trump is, but I don't think he's really interested. This is Jon Stewart, the host of The Daily Show. Yeah, I just don't think that's really his jam. Emma Malta says, J.D. Vance spent his speech on the Munich Security Conference today with 4chan-level rambling about social dictatorship EU being bad. I did see a clip. It was sort of an own goal. The only clip I saw of J.D. Vance was, I'm sure he said a lot of other dumb shit, but was complaining about that Romanian election, which I signposted as just a really bad sign that the Romanian government, with European applause, just decided to cancel an election because one of the guys was too popular on TikTok. J.D. Vance, I guess, is making a bit of a splash with what he's saying in Munich, and perhaps I should pay more attention to that. Oh no, Zendon God says, Xi's father died in his late 90s and his mother is still alive. So I think unless he starts chain smoking now, he's going to be around for a while. You can be around for a while and not be that competent, which also is not very inspiring of positive thoughts. Why do you think China hasn't lifted a finger on Syria? What would they plausibly benefit for lifting a finger on Syria? What is the... I think China quite intelligently largely avoids countries that the United States has put on their hate list. Of course, lately that's broken down a bit with systemically important countries like Russia or big oil providers like Iran, but Syria is not systemically important large economy, nor is it a large oil exporter, which Iran is. And even with Iran, despite these large proclamations of $400 billion deals. You remember the $400 billion deal between China and Iran? China feels the need still to hide its oil consumption from Iran by routing it through Malaysia. It's just China really doesn't... one of the stupidest, most insane things is that people talk about China filling the void in the Middle East, and China has zero interest in pissing away trillions of dollars in Middle East wars. That's a U.S. thing. That is not a China thing. And as Malta asks, what interest has China in Syria that would require them to get involved? I think China is very interested on a broader level in having sort of Belt and Road or debt or construction relationships with every country in the world. But they would, if the United States, has selected one of those countries, as we selected Syria to be one of the countries we hate and want to destroy, China just steers clear of it, and there's no reason why they wouldn't. Mm-hmm. Will the EU integrate? Asks Jan. I've definitely had moments like in the 2010s. It's like I don't know if the EU is going to survive this, but the EU keeps surviving. Eurosceptic leaders keep getting into power in European countries and discarding their Euroscepticism. I do think that sadly. In part out of xenophobia and The Economist writes articles about this, out of xenophobia and around Frontex, like a new broader European identity is in the process of forming. You've got things like what was that classic movie, L'Auberge Espagnole, that everybody loved to watch? That was really popular when I was a teen or 20-something, about just sort of, it was like a romantic comedy about European integration, very, very fundamentally. And it's still something that people find exciting. It's still people that younger generations identify with. I think that a lot of European, perhaps a hopeful sign is, I guess with the exception of Hungary, like a lot of European xenophobia is being directed towards vulnerable migrants rather than their neighbors, and I think there's a lot of talk about how they can work together. And I think the United States becoming more and more abusive and less and less interested in, as Malta pointed out with J.D. Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference, that was it yesterday or today. I think that as the United States becomes more and more committed to not just distancing but actually abandoning Europe, I think there will be more reasons for the EU to pull together. I know that the Hungarian right is obsessed with, or portions of the Hungarian right are obsessed with, revising the Treaty of Trianon and getting back territory like all of Croatia or whatever. But I think more broadly, left and right in Europe understands that if they're going to have any hope of functioning or competing in a world with the United States, China, and India now rising, Europe has to pull together. I think the EU is integrating, Jan, but it's not happening at a speed that really impresses at this point. And I think the COVID crisis actually witnessed some movement towards integration. I think the financial integration is sort of like the main stumbling block at this point. Having the same currency but not the same banking systems and financial approaches is just not currently working. But Logo Coolstream asks the very valid question: if China didn't lift a finger to help the Myanmar junta on their border, why would they care about MENA? Crazy people, I really need to do a Milei update. It's been a year, has it been a couple of years now that Milei has survived? Frankly, the fact that Javier Milei has survived as the president of Argentina for this long is really striking. And the level of destruction, do I think that more countries will want more psycho-libertarian governance? I mean, honestly, in the United States, we kind of have psycho-libertarian governments right now. You can make a strong case that Doge and Musk are basically doing Milei stuff on a much weaker, much smaller U.S. government sector. I don't know, maybe. I haven't really, I've sort of lost touch with what's going on in Argentina. Maybe, actually, I was looking for a second podcast to record this upcoming next week. Maybe I should do an Argentina update. Because it seems like people are really interested in that. It's so funny. Even when I was starting this channel, I was still a fairly committed libertarian and would have been very excited by Javier Milei. I will say that the Argentinian system research that I have done, I did do a podcast on Milei as he was just, I think Argentina and the Madman, I called it, as he was just taking power. And I think I expressed this at the time. It's just that Argentina, because of the weirdness of Peronism, the weirdness of 20th century history, had locked itself into a situation that kind of called a Milei into existence. I don't think chainsaw-wielding hyper-libertarianism is a good result for most countries. I don't think I mean, some of what, I think that some of what Elon Musk is currently doing in the United States could very well be valuable or useful, or sweeping away a bunch of old dead wood that could be replaced with something better. I think the majority of it is a guy who's looking to cut public services in order to fund another fucking tax cut. Milei can't do tax cuts, is my understanding. Milei has actually had to raise taxes because of the fiscal situation of his country is so dire, and they do not have the dollar. But I need to look more into what Milei has actually gotten up to in Argentina. I think that's very worth updating, which I have not. Do you think more countries will be inspired by Milei? I just think that the situation of Argentina was so uniquely bad, with sort of public sector unions being so dominant, the country's finances being so out of control, long promised resource super cycles that were going to save them never coming, that perhaps Argentina really did need a Milei. And I don't know if he's actually been more broadly successful, but I should look into that in the coming week. That's a great question, crazy people. Amhari, 24. Well, we're being very generous with the super chats, folks. I'm very grateful. Is Don squandering American soft power? Love your stuff. Also, Carmation State on YouTube has a Syria vid that meshes well with your recent videos on it. Carmation State. What is that? Carmation, is that like a Islamic sect? Like an old-time Islamic sect? Anyway. Is Don squandering American soft power? Yeah, but more than Biden's genocide? It's, and honestly, the lack of realism of Biden's choice to double down on Ukraine, which was, I think, celebrated by Europe at the time, I think is sort of, even while Biden was still president, and probably under Kamala Harris, was already revealed to be like kind of a trap. There's been a lot of outrage over the past week over Pete Hegseth, a man I loathe, the new Secretary of Defense, being like, yeah, obviously Ukraine's not getting into NATO, obviously. And that was also obviously the case under Biden. That was also obviously the case the whole time, yet Biden refused to just say that. Would that have saved us from a Russian invasion? Maybe not, probably not. But there were other actions that Biden could have taken. Everyone celebrated so majorly that, oh yeah, Biden knew for sure this was like this great moment for the CIA after 20 years of humiliation on the war on terror, that we got it right. We knew that Putin actually was going to invade. And it's like, if we knew that Putin was actually going to invade, why didn't we offer a concession to stop it? A concession that Pete Hegseth has already made, which isn't a concession because it's just an acknowledgement of reality, the reality that was always the case. So yeah, is Don squandering American soft power by being like such an all-fired a-hole towards Mexico and Canada and Denmark, which I think Denmark owns Greenland, and Canada? Yeah, that's bad. It's real bad. Is it worse than creating than failing to stop? And I think it is fair to say, like, look, Putin invaded Ukraine. He's the bad guy, obviously. I think, and I don't think many would dispute this, Loga, let me know you're a huge Ukraine fan. I don't think that it's inaccurate to say that Biden had levers he could have pushed and pulled to avert the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And he didn't do that, and that fucked over everybody. Inflation in the United States led to a second Trump administration, which I think will probably end in catastrophe. But inflation in Africa, some very few poorer countries in Asia, brought very real hardship, like having trouble to buy food, hardship, to not much real benefit. And yeah, Biden did a genocide in Gaza. So yeah, absolutely. Trump's like strongman shithead routine, terrible for U.S. soft power. Joe Biden's sponsorship of two wars, one of which is absolutely genocide, that I'd say that was worse for American soft power. Will Donald Trump end up being worse for American soft power by the end of his term? Entirely possible. But as outrageous, and like, I just can't get over, like, I didn't kill any children today, like, it's just real nice. And no matter how unbalanced and crappy Donald Trump seems, like, I didn't murder any children. I didn't murder 50 to 100 women and children, and some men in Gaza today. Um, and it's real hard for me to get over that. So yeah, I don't know. Like, am I getting Trump curious? Am I jumping on the Trump train? I think it's a little early to say that. But it's a lot of the outrage at this point is just like, I feel like this ceasefire in Gaza for me is like a real breath of fresh air, frankly. Perhaps I've over internalized it. Perhaps I don't have enough other things going on in my life and have like over identified with U.S. foreign policy. But no matter how crazy, all the crazy things that Trump has said, child murder hasn't been a big part of his governing approach thus far. And child murder was central to Joe Biden's government for the last 14 months he was in power. So, yeah, Trump is obviously a psycho doing unbalanced things. But yeah, he's just not as into murdering kids as the last guys were. And I like that. Wow. Malta says, I recently did the math and research, and the share of people in Germany currently not born in Germany is higher than it was in the U.S. at any point in recorded history that I could find. Now, I think there's a very right wing interpretation of that I know Malta is not arguing that, oh, no, all these migrants from the Middle East and Africa, blah blah blah. What Malta is actually referring to is the fact that because of the EU, Germany has sucked up a tremendous amount of Europeans. This is one aspect of the European project. And I think it actually, we've seen the full life cycle of this. I think that Romania was very heavily depopulated by the number of people that moved to Italy and Germany and other big EU economies when they could. And now some of them are moving back and founding businesses with the winnings that they've had. It's a really interesting dynamic of European integration that Germany has been the economic dynamo. Malta, did you see, has that fallen dramatically over the past couple of years as German industry has had difficulty with the loss of Russian gas? I don't know. But yeah, no, it is very interesting, and that's interesting that the share of foreign-born people in Germany, if you include Europeans, is higher than it's been in the United States at any point. I mean, that's pretty extraordinary, and does go some way towards explaining the popularity of Alternative for Deutschland and other right-wing parties. Who would be the best U.S. president right now? Which person should be president? I really liked Elizabeth Warren, not going to lie. I'm sure the first thing everybody thinks about when you say Elizabeth Warren is Pocahontas, and I think that's a bit of media choice. That's a media choice that deserves a little more examination. There are a lot of middle-aged white ladies in the United States that claim some degree of Native American ancestry. I think she did actually go and get a test, and I can't remember if she did or did not have Native American ancestry, but a tremendous amount of agonizing and time, and to the point where she felt like she had to deal with it, was put into the fact that she claimed some degree of Native American ancestry. And might have used it to get into a university or something like that. And I think it's pretty telling that scandal is the first thing you think of when you hear of Elizabeth Warren, a woman who has dedicated her life to making capitalism more humane in the United States. I think I really want to dive in, I don't know if I'll actually do this, to the CFPB, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. I need to figure out what the acronym is. Like, she came up with a whole new government in the aftermath of 2008. She came up with a whole new government department to protect U.S. citizens from Wall Street. That's amazing. She in the 2020, I remember seeing her speak in Iowa. Like, she had plans, like good plans, not like the I'm gonna let Elon Musk go in and break everything, hyper libertarian, we'll just see, hope it works out plans. Like, she had like real plans to attack most of the problems of the United States. I think, she's a woman, or she's got this thing where she pretended to be Native American. Like, I don't think any of those issues were anywhere nearly as disqualifying as the U.S. media made them. I liked Elizabeth Warren a lot, and I think she's probably too old now, but she would have made a pretty great president. So yeah, there you go. Is Trump a fascist? I think he does fascist things. The video that I made saying Donald Trump is a fascist in the run-up to... Man, it's interesting, and I think instructive about my own evolution. It's just like how on fire... I mean, I did a series of 8 to 10 videos in the 2020 year saying, like, never really making the case for Biden, because how could you? But essentially saying, like, Trump is a menace. This is why Trump is bad, this, that, and the other thing. In the 2024 election, I just really found it hard to go to bat for the child murderers that way. But I made a video in 2020 calling Trump a fascist because of 2 fascist things that he did, specifically the pardoning of Joe Arpaio, who is a really horrific sort of Bull Connor type figure in Arizona, who really prided himself on trampling on U.S. civil rights, basic humanity towards prisoners. Finally got convicted of something, I think not related to his more egregious crimes, but was finally convicted of something. Trump pardoned him. That was very fascist. And much, much worse, the Pentagon does in fact prosecute misconduct by U.S. soldiers if it's really, really egregious and they're caught doing it. And there were a number of U.S. war criminals who were convicted by the Pentagon that Donald Trump pardoned, though that I consider to be a fascist action, a sort of privileging of war and destruction and death over the basic rule of law. The most horrific and fascist action that he's ever taken. He was persuaded to do that by a Fox News commentator by the name of Peter Hegseth. Peter Hegseth was Donald Trump's choice and is now the Secretary of Defense of the United States, with the background of, yes, a veteran, but a Fox News commentator. Truly, that's a really abysmal choice that I think is quite fascist. As far as larger, deeply deep-seated, I think the pardoning of war criminals, the appointment of Pete Hegseth, these are pretty fascist things. But I don't have a really strong definition of fascist or even socialist, really. So yeah, I don't have I don't feel the need to really make pronouncements like that. Yeah, I did in 2020, and I believed it, and I stand by that video. But yeah, I guess I didn't realize how bad the Democrats could be. Trump certainly has some of the strongman airs of fascism, has certainly pardoned war criminals, but the piles of dead children in the 2024 election, that's the annihilation of the attempted annihilation of a people. That's a Democrat thing. Maybe I'd be more open to the suggestion that Joe Biden was a fascist. So yeah, I don't know. Malta says, I think my fault was eaten, but yes, I don't like, so it's not that he doesn't like the immigrants, but I think he doesn't like that. I think at this point, some anti-backlash was unavoidable societally, and I think that's probably true. Do you think Trump will be the last president of this generation? God, I hope so. Yes, I really do think Trump will be the last president of his generation. I have got to hope and pray that both the Democrats and the Republicans learn from this past election that running some mentally decayed septuagenarian is a bad idea. Trump was Trump and sort of the unavoidable nominee of his party. Biden was a choice, and a really bad fucking choice. It was a bad choice in 2020, but a choice that was made. So, yeah. can you see the Trump administration's approach of being public about foreign policy being a good thing, or should these discussions usually be behind closed doors? I think Trump administration's approach of being public about foreign policy is amazing and is absolutely the right way to do it. I think being behind closed doors is how you get a genocide. It's how you get a bunch of dipshits that, I mean, not that like the Trump administration isn't also working very hard for this perpetually receding Saudi-Israeli normalization. He is, but he's being open about it. Like the Biden administration said it cared about Ukraine, said it cared about China, but really seems to have spent most of its time dicking around in the Middle East and producing a genocide. So really, I'm working my way into the 1940s on this book that I'm reading. Like the United States foreign policy establishment in the aftermath of World War II was organized around some very fundamentally, intentionally anti-democratic procedures. The National Security Council, prerogatives that the U.S. president was sort of encouraged to take in the 1940s that have just been steamrolling or snowballing down the hill ever since. And I think those are bad things. I think that if the U.S. public had had the choice, we would not have. We were going to go to Afghanistan, but we would not have gone into Iraq. We would not have done a whole bunch of really stupid things. The whole nightmare of the war on terror under the Bush and Obama administrations was entirely a closed door, the experts deciding things, and it was an absolute catastrophe. That intentionally was guided by those closed-door smart people to take us from going after terrorists into great power competition. There was the same people who used the war on terror to antagonize people like Russia and China, specifically thinking of the whole Libya experience of the Security Council. It is. This whole idea that the experts are going to handle foreign policy behind closed doors, I think still had some credibility as late as the 1980s and the early 90s. I mean, George H.W. Bush and James Baker, as many horrific things as can be attributed to them, like I think kind of, had a little common sense and knew how to get things done and successfully navigated the end of the Soviet Union. Whether or not you attribute that to U.S. government actions, just getting through the end of the Soviet Union without World War III and a nuclear war, no matter what the U.S. role in the end of the Soviet Union was, is an impressive accomplishment. And I think a lot of these structures, the NSC, other things, like were put in place to help us navigate the Cold War, and the Cold War was navigated. Like it's over now. It's been over for 30 years. And I do see perhaps some hopeful and premature indications or commentary saying that, well, Trump is really, really ending the Cold War, the long 20th century, this, that, and the other thing. And I think that is definitely attributing too much intention to what he's doing and too much thought to what he's doing. But who knows? That may end up being what it is. So, yeah, that's a great question, and I am 100% in favor of a more public foreign policy, with exceptions, of course. There are definitely exceptions to this. There are things that presidents should keep close to their vest for national security, this, that, and the other thing. But I think vastly fewer than we have decided in practice. Yeah. It's just funny to read. Sarah Jessica Farter, asterisk, gerontocracy. I don't know what it's connected to, but it's just funny to read. Okay, Rob, but have you considered that Jake Sullivan wrote a book and made an interview where he felt sad about it? Doesn't that convince you he should be Secretary of State? Oh, did Jake Sullivan write a book saying he was sad about the genocide? I hadn't seen it. I don't think Jake Sullivan or Anthony Blinken should be allowed anywhere near anything foreign policy related for the rest of their lives. And they probably belong in jail. Bear says, our foreign policy is so horrible. This revolving door of politicians who don't know anything at all of the history of why things the way they are is really bad. Honestly, I think that you could make the case for ignorance at this point, honestly. I don't think we let our ignorant politicians have enough control and responsibility over our foreign policy. That's the whole point of the National Security Council. That's the whole point of the president coming in with these interchangeable Harvard-educated dipshits who do know the history or some of the history, probably mostly just 1938 in Munich, but like a little bit beyond that. And yeah, they've made a horrible hash of it. I mean, it's U.S. expertise that has destroyed the world. It's not U.S. ignorance. Um, Tyler McChronicle says, when you look up sociopath in the dictionary, there's a picture of Jake Sullivan. It's a really singularly grim-looking individual who just got grimmer and grimmer looking as the Biden administration went on, appropriately. All right, we are down to the last 2 minutes. You can keep me going with more super chats, but you've already been very generous thus far. So yeah, spieling. This is the More Freedom Foundation. We try to do things. I think this is the second week. No, it isn't. Maybe I'll get back to weekly production. We'll see. We definitely do a lot of daily shorts most days of the year. The More Freedom Foundation. On TikTok at More Freedom Foundation, that still exists. On Instagram at More Freedom Foundation. I'd love some more Instagram followers on More Freedom Foundation. I've been hovering right under 1,000 followers on Instagram, More Freedom Foundation account, and I'd love to just 15 of you could bump me up there. I've written a couple books. Everybody's Lying About Islam, about the U.S.-Saudi relationship, Avoiding the British Empire, sort of a stealth history of the modern world, talking about how the U.S. and the British empires are actually much more similar than we currently reflect, and how the United States is making a lot of the same problems, making the same mistakes. I am writing a book called American Empire, The First 100 Years, that should be out one of these years. What else? Sign up on Patreon. Logos put some links there. We do. I was falling off on those as well, but the patrons bring me back every month. We do a extensive in-person Zoom chat type thing on Discord, where we're back and forth, and we also do a patrons only newscast. So I want to do monthly public lives, but I almost always do a patrons only newscast like this, where we cover prepare 12 different options, and we discuss whatever the patrons want to discuss. And of course, if you sign up on Patreon, you get access to the patrons only Discord, which is a phenomenal place to discuss geopolitics and whatever else the patrons want to discuss. It's a great group of people, and I learn a lot on the Discord server. Will Trump get Gaza or Canada or Panama or Greenland? I don't think he's going to get Gaza or Canada or Panama or Greenland, is my expectation. I think he's already gotten some concessions from Panama is my understanding. And I think that's sort of the whole point of this, is he's going to get concessions from all of these places. Fewer, I think the normie consensus that he got fewer, the normie-led consensus that he got less out of his threats, his initial tariff threats to Canada and Mexico than he was saying is probably true. But yeah, it's an annoying strategy of brinkmanship. I don't actually expect within 4 years for the United States to be expanded to Canada, Greenland, Panama, or Gaza. Jesus. Anyway, we have done our 2 hours. Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to be able to talk to people in this capacity. There is no More Freedom Foundation without the patrons and its viewers, and I'm grateful to the patrons, of course, and anybody else who shows up to interact with my content. It's a tremendous privilege to be allowed to do this, and it's because of the viewers like you. Thank you. Should Canada join the EU, says Jan with a last chance super chat. No, would be my answer, Jan. The Canadians are rightly offended and hurt by Trump's behavior. There's not a lot of natural affinities there. I think Canada is already kind of in the US's EU. NAFTA, in weird way, has some parallels with the EU, though, of course, unlike the EU, and this might be something the NAFTA has that is over the EU, there is no one country for sure in charge in the EU. In NAFTA, we have that. Obviously, Canada is realizing what a raw deal it has with the United States. If the U.S. president is hostile and unpleasant, as Donald Trump is. But imagine just how much worse it would be if Canada decided to seriously affiliate with a consortium that we could see as a potential rival. I don't think Canada had the scope to join the EU even before NAFTA in the 1990s, and it certainly doesn't now. Canada is not a fully sovereign country. So I think it can't join the EU. And if it were, the punitive reactions by the United States would be outsized and wouldn't be like threats of horrific tariffs. They would be quite a deal more serious. Sarah Jessica Farter says, yeah, Mexico calls the shots in NAFTA, which is inaccurate. But again, what a great name Sarah Jessica Farter has. Anyway, thank you all so much. Very grateful to everybody who shows up for these things. It is a great pleasure and a great privilege to be able to talk about the world with you guys. Thank you all so much.